Hey there, I'm Emily Muhlstein, and this is a public hearing presentation for Amendment 39 to the Reef Fish Management Plan, and it deals with the regional management of recreational red snapper. So, red snapper is a federally managed species treated as one regulatory unit in the federal waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Recreationally, there is a 2-fish bag limit, a 16-inch minimum size limit, and the season opens on June 1st and remains open until the quota is projected to be met. Federal management measures may be impacted when the states adopt inconsistent regulations. That's because there is a Gulf-wide quota, and National Marine Fisheries Service and the Gulf Council are responsible for making management measures that constrain harvest to that quota. Currently, red snapper is considered to be overfished and is under a rebuilding plan. So the Council is considering a regional management scenario which would enable areas in the Gulf to use management measures that are more suitable to their specific regions. Red snapper would still have to remain a federally managed species, and it would still be subject to federal conservation goals, and that red snapper annual quota could not be exceeded. Regional management is being considered because it could provide flexibility for how the recreational quota is managed. Regions could tailor regulations to their local situations and also address some regional socioeconomic concerns. So this amendment contains 7 separate actions. The first action addresses the form that regional management would take on. The second action establishes the regions themselves. The third action would decide how to distribute quota among the different regions. The fourth action would deal with the management measures that the regions would have control over. The fifth action deals with for-hire permit restrictions. Action 6 considers accountability measures and overage adjustments. And Action 7 considers federal default regulations. So starting with Action 1, as I mentioned before, recreational regulations are the same across all federal waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The Council is going to have to decide whether they want to delegate authority to the regions to determine their own management measures, or if they want to retain control of specifying the management measures that will be used in the different regions. So the first alternative in Action 1 is the no action alternative. The second alternative, which is the Council's current preferred alternative, would delegate authority to the state or states to establish certain management measures for the harvest of an assigned portion of the recreational red snapper quota. And then the third alternative would allow the Council to specify the distinct recreational red snapper management measures for selected regions. Moving to Action 2, establishment of regions. If regional management is adopted, the Council will have to decide a couple of things. The first is how to establish those regions. The Council could select the regions, or the regions could establish themselves by submitting proposals to National Marine Fisheries Service. Second, the Council will have to decide how many regions to establish. The more regions there are, the more complex management becomes. Also, if different states decide to share regions, they're going to have to agree on shared management measures. So there are 4 different alternatives for Action 2. The first is the no action alternative. The second alternative would establish an east and west region in the Gulf of Mexico. The east region would consist of Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, and the west region would be Louisiana and Texas. The third alternative, which is the Council's preferred, would establish 5 separate regions that represent each Gulf state. And then the fourth alternative would allow each state or group of neighboring states to determine their own regions by submitting a proposal. So Action 3 considers the distribution of quota. Under a regional management system, the Gulf-wide recreational quota would be distributed among the different regions. And the Council is going to have to follow their established principles and guidelines for allocation to make these decisions. Also, if you're interested, you can find a table that shows the percentage of annual recreational red snapper landings by state from 1986 through 2012. If you go to this link, it'll bring you to our regional management guide, and you can find that table on page 5. So there's a number of different alternatives for Action 3. The first is the no action alternative, and that would not distribute the quota among the different regions. The second alternative would be to apportion the recreational red snapper quota among regions based on historical landings. There's a couple options here. You could use the time series from 1986 through 2012. You could use 1996 through 2012. You could use 2006 through 2012. Or you could use 50% from 1986 through 2012 and 15% from 2006 through 2012. The third alternative would be to exclude certain years from the time series. You could exclude 2006 and you could exclude 2010. Now that alternative can be chosen along with the other alternatives. Alternative 4 would establish eastern and western recreational red snapper quotas that would be divided at the Mississippi River. Now this alternative only applies if Action 2, Alternative 2 is selected as a preferred alternative. And then the fifth and final alternative would be to apportion based on 50% of average historical landings from 1986 through 2011 and 50% from 2006 through 2011. This would exclude landings from 2010 and round the resulting proportion. You'll notice the Council has not yet selected a preferred alternative for Action 3, and we'd like to hear your comments on that. Action 4 deals with regional management measures. So the Council and National Marine Fisheries Service are responsible for making management measures that ensure that the entire recreational harvest, including harvest in state waters, does not exceed the Gulf-wide quota. So the Council is going to have to decide which management measures could be modified at the regional level. So there are 7 different alternatives for this action. The first is a no-action alternative. The second alternative is one of the Council's preferred, and that would allow regions to modify season dates and structure. The third alternative, which is also a preferred, would allow regions to modify bag limits from 0 to 4 fish. The fourth alternative, which is also a preferred, would allow regions to change the minimum size limits from between 14 and 18 inches total length. The fifth alternative would allow regions to establish a maximum size limit. The sixth alternative, which is another Council preferred, would allow regions to establish closed areas within the federal waters that are adjacent to their region. And the final alternative, Alternative 7, which is also a preferred, would allow regions to establish sub-allocations in the private and for-hire subsectors. Moving on to Action 5, which deals with for-hire federal permit restrictions. So vessels with federal Gulf for-hire permits for refish have to abide by the more strict federal regulations when state regulations are different. Now keep in mind that if delegation of control to the states under regional management is not selected in Action 1, then this rule is going to remain in effect. So there's 2 alternatives here. The first is a no-action alternative, and the second alternative, which is the Council's preferred, would not require vessels with a Gulf charter or headboat permit to comply with the more restrictive of federal recreational red snapper regulations when fishing in state waters. So on to Action 6, which considers accountability measures adjusting for regional overages. So postseason accountability measures addressed overages if landings exceed the Gulf-wide quota. Currently, there are no accountability measures for red snapper. Instead, the Scientific and Statistical Committee reviews landings and yield projections each year and updates the acceptable biological catch. So there are 4 separate alternatives here. The first is the no-action alternative, and that would not create postseason accountability measures for red snapper. The second alternative would be if combined landings from all regions exceed the Gulf-wide quota, then that Gulf-wide quota will be reduced in the following year by the amount of the overage. The third alternative, which is the Council's preferred, is if a region exceeds its own regional quota, then that region's quota will be reduced in the following year by the amount of the overage. And the fourth alternative would be if combined landings from all the regions exceed the quota, then you would base the following year's quota on buffers that are calculated by the annual catch limit, annual catch target control rule. Now there's sub-options that apply for alternatives 2, 3, and 4 here. The first option would allow for a 1-year grace period before implementation of a postseason accountability measure, or the second option, which is option B, would allow for a 2-year grace period before implementation of a postseason accountability measure. And finally, we move on to Action 7, which deals with default regulations. So if the Council delegates management authority to different regions, federal default regulations must be in place to ensure that federal conservation goals are still achieved. The default regulations would be applied in the federal waters off of a region if a region's delegation is suspended or if a region opts out of delegation. Now, those default regulations would apply to all recreational fishing vessels in that portion of the exclusive economic zone. So the first alternative is the no action alternative. The second alternative has two options. The Council's preferred is that during the suspension of delegation, the recreational harvest of red snapper in federal waters off such a state would be restricted to default regulations. Now, option B would prohibit any harvest until delegation is reinstated. Preferred alternative 3 is if a state opts out of delegation, then the default regulations would apply in federal waters off of that state. We would really like to hear your thoughts on regional management of recreational red snapper. You can submit your comments online, and you can contact us with any questions at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to the presentation and to send us your thoughts.